On October 21, 1805, the British fleet, commanded by Vice-Admiral Horatio Nelson, sailed into battle against the combined fleet of the French and Spanish empires. Nelson was outnumbered, and he was outgunned. He opted to attack them in the most aggressive formation possible, two lines of ships heading straight towards the heart of the enemy fleet. The victory that Nelson won at Trafalgar would become one of the most celebrated naval victories of all time. It was a victory that set the seal on Britain's dominance of the world's oceans. It was a victory that ended any chance that Napoleon and the French might be able to invade England. It was a victory, also, that cost the life of its chief architect, Horatio Nelson, who died on his ship, just as he heard that the day was his. The Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, Nelson thwarts Napoleon. On January 8, 1806, an unprecedented funeral was held in England. The casket was conveyed down the Thames in a royal funeral barge. The next day, it was transferred to a hearse shaped like a warship that sailed through the streets to St. Paul's Cathedral. Tens of thousands of weeping onlookers filled the cathedral and lined the roads. The man who had been granted these honors was a warrior who had won a spectacular and crushing victory over a superior force and delivered his nation from years of desperate fear of invasion by an implacable and terrifying foe. He would be forever remembered as Admiral Nelson. By the early 1800s, naval warfare had undergone a series of rapid changes. Deep-hulled ships propelled by square-rigged sails that could tack against the direction of the wind were now capable of carrying enough supplies to cross vast oceans with ease. Mounted on these great ships were heavy cannons, a technology that marked a new era of naval warfare. But only one or two cannons could be mounted at the front or stem of a ship. Thus, guns were positioned mainly along the sides. This meant that ships could not shoot in the same direction that they were moving and could not fire more than half their guns at any one enemy ship. In the innate of battle formation, the fleet of one adversary would line up in a long column, all sailing in the same direction. The two opposing lines of warships sailed in opposite directions, firing broadsides at one another. The two sides simply pounded one another until a ship sank, caught fire, or suffered so many casualties that it had to surrender. A typical warship of this period had 2 or 3 decks for guns. The largest warships carried between 64 and 120 guns. These warships represented an enormous investment of money and resources to construct, were extremely costly to operate, and incorporated the most cutting-edge technology of the day. The dominant power in naval warfare in the 18th and 19th centuries was England, and they possessed a large number of excellent natural harbors from which the main sea routes to Europe could be controlled. England used this great natural advantage and developed the largest merchant marine in the world, as well as the largest and most efficient navy to protect it. England's greatest enemy during this time was France, which had just undergone the chaos of the French Revolution and had fallen under the rule of an ambitious military genius, Napoleon Bonaparte. Through a series of astonishing and swift campaigns, Napoleon extended his dominion over much of Europe, from Spain to the borders of Russia. The instrument of his success was his grand army, a highly trained, unified force that, at its peak, numbered more than 700,000 men. By 1804, Napoleon's army stood poised along the French coast, and he had thousands of barges constructed to ferry his troops across the English Channel. What stood in his way were the mighty warships of the English Royal Navy. Against the French menace, the English strategy was to preserve control of the seas by not allowing the French Navy to leave its harbors. Outside of every major French harbor, a squadron of English ships kept up a constant blockade, maintained even during storms, placing an enormous strain on the ships and their crews. Many of the ships and men that sustained this vigil against the French and fought in the war at sea have become legendary, but none more so than Horatio Nelson. Nelson was born in 1758 to a prosperous family and was sent to sea at the age of 12 as a midshipman. He rose through the ranks to lieutenant and eventually captain, and fought in a number of battles, in which he established a reputation as a particularly innovative and aggressive officer. He was also one who led from the front, a practice that took a physical toll. In one battle, he lost an eye, and in another, his right arm was shattered by a musket ball and had to be amputated. The loss of his eye and arm did nothing to impair the success of his career, however. By 1798, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe and decided to lead an expedition to Egypt. He amassed a large fleet of warships and transports to carry his army and personally took charge, sailing to Egypt, landing near Alexandria, and subduing the country after fighting several battles. While Napoleon fought in Egypt with the army, his fleet anchored in a line close to the shallow water in a strong defensive position near the mouth of the Nile at Trafalgar Bay. Nelson was sent with a smaller force of ships to attempt to destroy the French fleet and strand Napoleon in Egypt. In his typically aggressive fashion, he sailed to Trafalgar Bay, arriving near dusk and, rather than waiting for the next day, attacked immediately. The action that followed is known as the Battle of the Nile. The French vessels were larger and more heavily armed, but the British were better trained and attacked enthusiastically. The most dramatic moment of the battle came when the French flagship, the Orient, an enormous three-decker with more than 100 guns, caught fire, and the gunpowder magazine exploded, blowing the ship apart. By the morning, the English fleet had won a decisive victory, and the majority of the French ships were either captured or destroyed. This was an important victory for England, and a huge blow to the French. Without the support of his fleet, Napoleon was forced to give up the expedition. In the end, he had to abandon most of his army in Egypt and sneak back to France alone. Although Napoleon might be dominant on land, as long as England controlled the sea, his dreams of world conquest would remain unrealized. By the middle of 1805, the English blockade had been going on for years, and Napoleon was getting tired of waiting. By capturing Spain, he had also gained control of the Spanish fleet, and his new plan was to combine the French and Spanish fleets into a force so large that it could overwhelm any English opposition. This combined fleet would sweep up from Spain, push aside or destroy the English ships in the Channel, and give his army the chance it needed to cross. The admiral put in charge of his mission, Villeneuve, amassed a combined fleet of 33 ships, including a number of particularly large battleships, including the biggest, most powerful ship in the world, the colossal four-deck, 136-gun Santissima Trinidad. On October 20, 1805, the combined fleet set out from Cadiz. Nelson was charged with stopping the fleet, and he had 27 English ships to oppose it, including his flagship, the 102-gun Victory. At a meeting of his captains, Nelson outlined a bold new strategy. Rather than using the line of battle, Nelson planned to form his ships into two shorter lines perpendicular to the French and charge straight at them, cutting the French line of battle in two places. His ships would then cluster around those of the enemy and attempt to overwhelm them. The two fleets met off Cape Trafalgar in Spain. It was the biggest battle of the age, involving 60 ships of the line and 50,000 men. As Nelson sailed toward the enemy, he used signal flags to send a message to his crews that has since become one of the most famous in military history. England expects that every man will do his duty. The battle unfolded much as Nelson had intended, with the two columns of English ships having to endure the combined fleet's fire as they approached head-on, unable to return fire from their fronts. Nelson and the Victory led one of the English lines, and one of his trusted captains led the other. Both succeeded in breaking the combined fleet's line of battle, and the conflict turned into a confused melee of ships blasting at each other at point-blank range. As the battle raged, the Victory was surrounded by several enemy ships. Nelson was pacing back and forth on the deck when a musket ball shot from the mast of a French ship struck him in the shoulder, passed through his chest, and lodged in his spine. Nelson immediately realized the wound was fatal, and he died later that day. As he was brought beneath deck for medical attention, the men held a sheet over his face, as he had instructed them to do, so that the ship's gunners wouldn't see their admiral dying and lose the fight in them. He lived long enough to hear the news that his fleet had won a crushing victory over the enemy. "Thank God I have done my duty," he exclaimed. Of the French and Spanish ships, All but 11 were captured or sunk. The combined fleet suffered 7,000 casualties. On the English side, not a single vessel was lost, though many were heavily damaged, and there were 1,600 casualties. Although Napoleon's power was as yet unchallenged on the continent, Trafalgar put an end to his plans to invade England. The battle guaranteed that there would always be a strong European nation that could and would provide opposition to him. As long as the Royal Navy dominated the seas, Napoleon's goal of universal dominion over Europe would be unachievable. After Trafalgar, Napoleon pulled his armies away from the English Channel and instead committed them, disastrously, to the invasion of Russia. Although it would still take much to defeat Napoleon, Trafalgar was the battle that checked his ascendancy and marked the beginning of his decline. As Admiral Nelson and his men, aboard the mighty Victory, sailed head-on into the cannons of the French and Spanish fleet, it's said the men cheered and sang, "Rule, Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves."